Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway. Gayatri is still away, continuing her research into global warming. This week, the Prime Minister announced that he had ordered the extrajudicial killing of 2 Syrian-based British terrorists. It was the first ever such act, but the PM assured us it was perfectly legal, even if he couldn't show us how. It puts Britain in the elite company of Israel and the United States, as the only 3 countries in the world incinerating people by drone. Accompanying his announcement of the return of the death penalty, but without charge or trial, Mr. Cameron said we'd have to join the Syrian war against both the Assad regime and the ISIS rebels. He promised hard military force, though whether our own or someone else's remains unclear. For clarity on such matters, it's always best to turn to the Stop the War Coalition, and I'm joined now by one of their national officers, author and academic, Dr. Chris Nineham. Dr. Chris, thanks for joining us. Am I right? Are we headed into yet another war?
It looks like there's a serious effort now to garner enough votes in Parliament to push through a vote to escalate the bombing of Syria. Of course, we are already at war in Syria, really. I mean, we've got special forces on the ground. We've been involved in these drone attacks and in actual military, in bombings anyway.
Yes, with our pilots flying under other people's roundels.
Unbelievably.
Yes.
But now it seems that they're going to try and make this official. It's incredible because one of the things they're doing is they're trying to use the refugee crisis, unbelievably, as a kind of rationale for more bombing, when in fact the vast majority of people know, and even many media commentators make it clear, that the refugee crisis is a product of the carnage that the West has created in the last, going back 15 years in terms of the attacks in the Middle East and Libya and elsewhere. So, I mean, reality is being stood on its head in order to justify yet another war.
It's even worse than we imagined, though, because if he had announced this week that we were going to be bombing ISIS alone, that would be alarming enough, given the consequences of it that we've seen so plentifully in Iraq and then in Libya. But he actually said that we're going to make war against both sides in this war, which begins to sound a bit complicated and a bit daunting. After all, the Syrian regime is supported by Russia, by Iran, by Hezbollah, but it has a powerful army that's been fighting now for 5 years. Does the Queen really have enough soldiers to go into that kind of war on 2 fronts?
No.
It seems mad.
It's extraordinary. I mean, you know, a lot of MPs said one of the reasons they voted against it last time around in 2013 was because there wasn't a plan. Well, if there wasn't a plan then, there really is no idea, no strategy whatsoever. It strikes me this is partly being put together for domestic consumption. Partly, I think, this is a response to the potential of Jeremy Corbyn being the leader of the Labour Party come the weekend. And I think, you know, to a large extent, this is driven by domestic considerations. And also, I think Cameron managed to put a brave face on it back in 2013. But I think the fact that Parliament, under pressure from the population, overturned his effort to start bombing Syria 2 years ago caused them consternation, actually, because I don't think they like being told by Parliament that they can't fight wars. And I think, to some extent, this is revenge.
Well, I was there, as you know, speaking in that debate. You were with our other colleagues marshalling the crowds outside. It was a considerable victory that we rightly celebrated. But then the proposal was that we become ISIS's air force, that we bomb the regime, effectively assisting ISIS into power. You would have thought that such a ludicrous idea would have put them off. But no, they've come back for more. And in the last few days, it's become clear that Russia is deepening its relations with the Syrian regime, stepping up military cooperation. So we begin to see an internationalization, the official internationalization of this conflict, which must be pregnant with very, very serious consequences potentially.
No, I think it's potentially catastrophic. I mean, you can already see in a slight tangent the way in which war is spreading through the region with what is, I believe, verging on a civil war in Turkey now, which was partly a product of the fact that NATO, because they wanted to draw Turkey into some sort of anti-ISIS alliance, were prepared to allow Turkey to attack the Kurds openly, and that has understandably created a reaction. So that now means that, you know, there's mobs of people attacking Kurds on the streets of Turkish cities. That's a conflict that is beginning to be militarized. So I mean, the internationalization of the civil war in Syria is absolutely the last thing that we need. It's the thing that is going to potentially spread war across the region. It's the thing that is going to create more chaos, more carnage across the Middle East. And of course, it's the thing that is going to cause the most bitterness and anger on the ground, and therefore lead to the potential spread of jihadism and the spread of terrorism, the very things we're told that this war is being fought against. So it's completely irrational.
The spread of this fanaticism, this jihadism, is of course a clear and present danger everywhere, including here in our own country. The point is that what you do about it should make the problem less rather than more. As normal, it seems we've chosen the very weapon that's likely to enhance extremism. An extrajudicial assassination of 2 British citizens, perhaps 3, on the pretext that they were planning a terrorist attack on events which had already taken place by the time of the assassinations. Legal assurance from the attorney that it was perfectly legal, but which we can't be shown. And all based on intelligence from the same people who brought us the weapons of mass destruction, canard. This drone attack draws us deeper into this vortex, doesn't it?
Like so often in these cases, the narrative, you know, what is it, a few days after the event is beginning to unravel. I mean, as you say, we were trying to prevent, apparently, an attack that had already happened. That makes no sense. It also makes no sense that these people were able to launch an attack in Britain from Syria. We're told that they had collaborators. Why weren't those collaborators arrested, and why weren't they brought in front of a court? We're supposed to have due process. There is no, as my understanding is, there is no policy of execution on suspicion in this country at the moment, and yet that is exactly what happened. There seems to me to be no, just at the level of the kind of, you know, the legality of this, there's clearly no justification for what happened. It seems to me that this incident was all part of the attempt to beat the drum of war for further attacks on Syria, to create this impression that somehow Syria is, you know, so militarised, so dangerous. That
45 minutes away from attacking us.
Exactly. I mean, all the memories of what happened in Iraq. You have the Attorney General gave the go-ahead for the legal advice for the legality of the war back in 2003, in the end, under duress. We had the security services and the intelligence people telling us there were these weapons of mass destruction. All that turned out to be fabricated. And once again, it's very important, I think, that people use their critical faculties and don't allow themselves to be drawn into what is now becoming a kind of media hysteria around the question of bombing Syria. That's really, in the end of the day, what I think all this is about.
And as you say, so grotesque is it that the son, hater of all refugees and immigrants, is using the dreadful image of the little boy drowned on the beach as a badge to support their campaign for more war and war now, using the victims of war as a recruiting sergeant for more war. We're not going to persuade David Cameron. Is there any possibility that enough Conservative MPs will rebel and break ranks on this? And is there a possibility that Labour will solidly vote against war in Syria?
Well, I mean, I think the narrative and the argument and the rhetoric being put forward is so threadbare that I think it is up for grabs. And I definitely feel at the level of public opinion there's been a big shift. I mean, public opinion in general on these interventions is very, very good in Britain overall. But I think just in the last couple of weeks, there's been, first of all, a massive shift in people's attitude to the whole refugee crisis. I think people are joining the dots. They are recognising that if you look at the countries of origin, the 3 or 4 top countries of origins of these refugees, they're all war-torn countries: Syria, Afghanistan, in some of the statistics, Somalia. You know, these are countries that have been Iraq that have been devastated by the wars. And I think people are making those links. So it's up for grabs. And I think the point is we've got to do just as we did in 2013. We've got to put maximum pressure on the politicians, and we've got to lobby them and protest and try and twist their arm to make them realise that they've got to represent public opinion rather than the prejudices and mad policies that are coming from Whitehall and from Washington. Now, I think this is a very open question. Obviously, the Corbyn surge is another testimony to the level of concern and questioning there is about the record of recent British foreign policy. So, you know, I very much hope Jeremy does get elected on Saturday. I guess he probably will. We've got to use that as a way of launching a really massive campaign, because that won't be the end of it. They're going to try and undermine him. They're already trying to twist the arms of some of the Labour backbenchers to get them on side. There's going to be a big battle of hearts and minds in the next few weeks. And we've got to be out in the streets making sure we put maximum pressure on.
Well, the Stop the War Coalition, of which I'm one, claimed, and I think rightly, that we helped ease Tony Blair out of the door of the Labour leadership. Our president, Jeremy Corbyn, by the time of the later editions of this programme today, hopefully will be the new leader of the Labour Party. As you look back now over the last dozen years that we've been doing this, more than a dozen years, 14, do you think the Stop the War feeling in Britain is here to stay?
I do. I think there has been a sea change over the last 15, as you say, 14 years. And which is partly, obviously, a kind of sort of like spontaneous response to the disasters of the war that have been created in Afghanistan and Iraq. But I also think it's been built on by the campaigning. I think as well, the response that people have had to the refugees in the last couple of weeks is testimony again to a kind of critical understanding amongst large numbers of people in Britain about what foreign policy does. So I think there's lots of hope. In terms of people are really quite engaged in these questions. It's been quite dominant in the whole Labour leadership election, actually, which is interesting.
It has indeed. Dr. Chris Nineham, thanks for joining us on the Sputnik. After the break, it's race and the police. It never goes away, you know. Welcome back to Sputnik. The question of race and policing is seldom far from the headlines in Britain, and particularly so in London. Deaths in custody, deaths before custody, stop and search powers. It's not that we are Ferguson, Missouri, but that we are on the same road. Britain's most prominent black leader is my old comrade Lee Jasper, and he joins us now on the Sputnik to discuss this. Lee, thanks for coming back on board. Let me tell you what happened to me this week. On a national radio show, I asked all the Tory hopefuls for London Mayor, Zach Goldsmith and the also Rands, a question. My question was, my experience of the police in London has been a good one, almost invariably, but then I've got blue eyes, a white face and a white collar. The experience of hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, of other Londoners is not the same. And if you're honest enough to acknowledge this, I said to them, you need to tell us what you're going to do about it. Every one of them, Zach Goldsmith and the others, tried to say that things are much, much better now in London than they were before on the question of race and policing. Is that true?
No. It's patently untrue, and it shows that they've not mastered their brief in seeking to govern a multicultural city, a multi-faith city like London. Increase in race hate crimes, particularly Islamic attacks on Muslim women, up 70%. Race hate attacks more generally, up incredible numbers. Number of black police officers in London, down from what it was at its peak in 2007. Net increase in black officers in the Met? I'm afraid not. It's a net loss. So we're losing those that are at the 30-year retirement age, and we're not recruiting at the bottom end to bring them in. The requirement that you fund your police foundation course out of your own pocket for new recruits has had an obvious effect on black and ethnic minority communities who struggle with high unemployment and high rates of poverty. And then you have the fact that under Boris Johnson's tenure, we've seen the worst deterioration in relations between black communities and the police. And if you look at public confidence in Tower Hamlets, in Brixton, in places like Lambeth, in Hackney, in Haringey, the key symbolic areas where big black and ethnic minority communities, public trust and confidence of black and ethnic minority communities has gone down to its lowest level. So had they taken their time to do their homework, they would have found that there are more race complaints against the Met now than at any other time in its history. There is a declining number of black and ethnic minority officers, and that'll get worse as we have loss of officers, that public confidence and trust in them from those communities is the worst it's ever been, and that we are no better off now than we are in the immediate aftermath of Mark Duggan.
I'm speaking at one of, you're in perpetual motion on these issues. One of your many campaigns is about a new incident which has arisen, about a shooting in Lambeth, which seems to have begun over a row over rent arrears. Tell us about that.
Well, on the Friday, the 21st of August, we had a standoff on a housing estate, Tilton Gardens, which is in the south of Lambeth. We had a standoff between armed police and an individual in a flat. Subsequently, he was shot by the police after a 9-hour standoff. We've subsequently learned that this was a 30-year-old black man, that he'd been subject to an eviction from his property, and that being homeless, he'd gone back to the property. His neighbours tell us that he's a quiet lad. He's not known to the police as far as we know. Their impression was of him, he was as good as gold and very quiet. They tell me that he got back into the property because the housing association, Metropolitan Housing Association, who owns the estate, didn't change the locks. And so his key worked. And being homeless, as you can imagine, having nowhere to stay, he returned to the property, maybe to pick up some things or whatever. He was visited at that time while he was in the property by a housing officer who'd brought along the police. Now, I don't understand what police have got to do with civil matters of eviction. But nevertheless, they were brought along. The police reported that they saw a weapon. We still don't know whether this weapon was in a kitchen drawer, whether it was a water gun, a spud gun, or whether he was waving it about manically and threatening to shoot. We know nothing. And he was subsequently shot 4 times, I will mark you, by high-caliber weaponry. How this young man, well, not so young, but how this man is still alive is beyond me. He was shot 4 times. And the subsequent clampdown by the Metropolitan Police, the Independent Police Commission, means we know virtually nothing about the circumstances in which a man can ostensibly be shot in his own home over a matter that is trivial. So we're deeply perplexed in Lambeth. And because Boris Johnson abolished all police consultative groups after April last year, there was a response, a recommendation by Lord Scarman post-1981 to maintain communications precisely at times like this. Because they are now abolished, we have no means of finding out what the detail of what actually happened is, and we're demanding that they bring that detail forward.
And it's the vacuum of information, which is then filled by anger and speculation, which leads to the kind of problems that do happen in Ferguson, Missouri, recently, and have happened in our own country, in our own city, many times punctuated, maybe a decade in between them, but it's exactly the kind of flashpoint that you want to avoid.
Well, it's interesting because post-Mark Duggan, we were told by the Commissioner that he wanted to be the most transparent police service in the world. And Boris Johnson, the Home Secretary and others said, we're going to introduce body cam videos for officers so that we can film exactly what's happening as a means of reassuring communities who, in the wake of Mark Duggan's, bizarre inquest verdict, he didn't have a gun, but he was lawfully killed. Nobody still understands that one could seek to reassure communities that officers were operating at the highest level of professionalism. There were 13 body cam videos in this particular shooting for this young man. And the IPCC and the Metropolitan Police Service have now told us that those videos will be used as evidence, which means they can't possibly be used for reassuring people about what actually happened in a timely fashion. It will be some 2 to 3 years after the event when all the legal proceedings around his case have come to a conclusion. And so even the good practice that we managed to secure for them, where have officers wear body cams, now becomes largely redundant as a means of reassurance, simply because it's now going to be treated as evidence and we won't be able to see it until the end of any trial.
We have a situation which I've heard you adumbrate before on the issue of stop and search, which again these Tory mayoral hopefuls were indicating had been fantastically reduced, two-thirds reduced, where, first of all, black and minority ethnic people are far more likely to be stopped and searched. If they're found, for example, with cannabis, far more likely to be charged. If charged, tell us, I've heard you give this set of statistics, which frankly is mind-boggling.
Well, stop and search in London as a whole is going down, but it's going down for white people. It's going up for black people, even within the overall figure. So that's your answer to the detail. But if you are stopped and searched, the disproportionality in terms of charging black and ethnic minority citizens, you and I are first-time offenders, so we have no previous record. We steal a loaf of bread. I am more likely to be charged and sent for trial. You're more likely to receive a caution, a talking to, and sent on your way home. And this disproportionality happens around a whole area of criminality, but it's most acute and extensive in the area of drugs. So if you get a first-time offender and £5 bag of cannabis, and I have the same, we're first-time offenders, I go to court, you get a caution. If I get caught with a £10 bag of cocaine, and so do you, and we're first-time offenders, I am then 70% more likely to be sent to court to face trial than you are. You're more likely to receive a caution. And the really interesting thing about that is the Ministry of Justice statistics on race and criminal justice system says not only is that disproportionality in charging confirmed, but if you're white and you have antecedents of criminal activity, you're still less likely to go to court than a black person with no antecedents or with a lesser antecedents than you have. And these are the government's own figures, which I look at with great interest, but can only assume that they're woeful underestimates of the reality of what's going on. So we have a war on drugs that is a war on black and ethnic minority peoples. We have a war on terror that is exactly the same thing, a war on black and ethnic minority peoples. We have disproportionate charging of black people for like crimes than white. To my mind, this is almost a sort of, if you like, a soft apartheid policing, whereas we're equal citizens in the same city, but God forbid we meet up with the Metropolitan Police, because one of us will be heading for that criminal justice system in pretty short order.
And the other will not.
Yeah.
The last question, what can be done about this? The recruitment of significant numbers of black and minority ethnic officers has gone into reverse, as you have pointed out. I didn't know that myself last night, or I made that point. Gone into reverse. Is there a culture developing because there's such a perception of racism in the police that black and minority ethnic people don't want to join the police because their community might somehow be offended if they do?
No, two things happened. Black people were joining the police force. When Ken Livingstone was mayor, we made a determined effort to increase. We increased black and ethnic minority police recruitment by 100% between 2004 and 2007. So we know how to do it. We know what inspires confidence. The problem is that once the officers were in the force, they were disproportionately disciplined as a consequence. So the example of the firearms officer Carol Howard, who was fitted up by her colleagues on charges of sexually abusing her own child, found to be completely innocent of all charges and exonerated and walked away. That is the working culture in which black officers are enduring. And because the Commissioner of Police and the Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, summarily announced in 2009 that institutionalised racism is no longer a problem for the police, what we've seen is a resurgence of the culture of racism within the workplace, the police canteen type culture, a stripping away of the Macpherson monitoring policy frameworks that made sure that where that continued to be a problem, one could apply pressure. And because of Boris's and the Commissioner's lack of commitment to real anti-racism in policing, what we've seen is a resurgent culture of institutionalised racism make itself apparent in the Met Police.
Well, we'll have to see what we can do about all this. Lee Jasper, thank you very much for joining us on the Sputnik. Alas, we've run out of time, and that's the end of the show. God willing, I'll be back again next week. It's been marvellous.